Welcome to the Audiobook Vault. Today, our book is about the unyielding architectural principles of high-stakes social engineering and the cold-blooded strategic subroutines required to transform your conscious mainframe into an absolute master of the social game, capable of neutralizing toxic personalities, dismantling competitor networks, and executing permanent psychological dominance, while your physical vessel remains in a state of absolute strategic stillness and non-reactive sovereignty. The modern social matrix has conditioned the fragile, unvetted masses to operate under the submissive, self-deluding fiction that naive empathy, absolute transparency, and unconditional cooperation are the core pillars of professional and interpersonal success. Let us strip away these soft, decorative lies from the very first seconds of this elite audio transmission. The global social arena is not a collaborative sanctuary. It is a complex, hyper-competitive ecosystem driven by territorial power dynamics, status preservation, and latent hostility, where reactive actors are continuously harvested by clinical manipulators and toxic predators. Operating with unstructured good intentions is a catastrophic operational vulnerability that leaves your emotional bandwidth and psychological borders completely open to active subversion, microaggressions, and institutional sabotage. True sovereignty completely rejects this porous behavioral stance. You understand that to survive and conquer the modern social hierarchy, you must systematically decouple your nervous system from external validation loops and treat every human interaction not as an emotional exchange, but as a precise strategic calculation designed to secure your absolute psychological autarky. Have you ever paused to execute a forensic audit on the massive structural divergence between the 99% of individuals who spend their adult lives constantly trapped in exhausting cycles of workplace drama, relationship anxiety, and reactive defense maneuvers, and the elite 1% of sovereign operators who move through chaotic social battlefields with absolute unblinking calm, permanently dictating the parameters of every conversation they enter? Have you ever wondered why the vast majority of professionals allow their focus to be completely castrated by the subtle, manipulative scripts of toxic colleagues or gaslighting executives, while elite power architects can neutralize a multi-pronged corporate coup or an aggressive industry rival with a single cold look or a calculated prolonged silence? This stark psychological divide does not exist because those elite actors possess an exotic genetic intellect. It exists because they have permanently purged social sentimentality from their conscious servers and adopted the clinical engineering principles of social framework insulation. The average individual steps into a room looking for immediate comfort, consensus, and collective approval. The master architect steps into the arena looking for the underlying status geometry, isolating the active threats and mapping the psychological vulnerabilities of their primary academic targets. Competitors, and installing an invisible neural firewall that blocks external manipulation loops from ever breaching their operational perimeter. To activate this elite sovereign baseline within your daily professional theater, you must immediately execute the behavioral transition from high-frequency verbal reaction to absolute kinetic stillness. The unvetted individual approaches a social confrontation or an aggressive corporate play by launching a frantic verbal defense, over-explaining their actions and venting their frustrations to peers, which instantly exposes their strategic soft parameters to their rivals and provides their competitors with the exact data payload required to execute a high-velocity counterstrike. The steel mind completely bypasses this trap by deploying the absolute law of communication compression. When a toxic competitor attempts to destabilize your internal homeostasis through passive-aggressive insults, public criticism, or manufactured professional emergencies, you do not engage in their hyperverbal narrative game. you maintain complete neurological detachment, forcing your physical engine to exhibit absolute physical stability while you allow their verbal ultimatums to hang in a heavy, freezing conversational vacuum. By deliberately withholding your emotional reaction, you trigger immediate cognitive disorientation within your rival, who relies entirely on your defensive compliance to fuel their status dominance loop. Your silence becomes an impenetrable black hole that absorbs their strategic momentum, leaving their perimeter completely overextended and exposed to a clinical liquidation counterplay. This extreme systematic insulation prepares your mainframe for the cold execution of target fragmentation and the total neutralization of toxic social networks. True social mastery requires you to view toxic actors and corporate competitors not as emotional enemies to be openly hated, but as dynamic friction variables to be calculated and systematically bypassed, or converted into passive tools for your own vertical expansion. You do not waste precious energy engaging in loud public arguments or emotional boardroom standoffs. You operate entirely behind the scenes, analyzing the hidden insecurity nodes and status dependencies that drive your competitors' behavioral conditioning. By observing their recurring patterns of vanity, validation-seeking, and loss aversion, you map out the exact geometric architecture of their cage, allowing you to quietly redirect the surrounding institutional traffic lanes away from their perimeter and isolate them from the central source of resource allocation. Before your rival even realizes that their operational foundation has been structurally hollowed out, you step into the vacuum as the undisputed authority, leaving their fragile matrix permanently decentralized and submissive to your steel frame. To advance into the second layer of social framework insulation, you must master the precise structural decoding of covert manipulative scripts and the tactical deployment of psychological firewalls designed to permanently neutralize narcissistic aggression and corporate gaslighting. The average corporate professional drifts through their workplace environment, operating under the fragile assumption that all interpersonal feedback is grounded in objective performance metrics, failing to realize that toxic actors utilize verbal communication not to exchange information, but to actively manipulate status geometry and capture psychological leverage over your baseline neural servers. When a narcissistic competitor or a manipulative executive deploys subtle backhanded compliments, gaslighting revisions of historical agreements, or calculated microaggressions in public meetings, they are executing an active penetration test against your internal emotional borders. If you process their verbal payloads through a sentimental filter, attempting to defend your intentions or seek qualitative reconciliation, you submissively grant them absolute access to your prefrontal cortex, allowing their manufactured toxic static to flood your nervous system with chronic cortisol production and immediate decision-making paralysis. The sovereign completely rejects this vulnerable interactive model. You treat all manipulative behavior as a predictable series of mechanical subroutines driven by deep-seated status insecurity and loss aversion panic. This defensive fortification requires the immediate implementation of the analytical detachment protocol and the absolute serialization of incoming behavioral data points. The steel mind does not internalize the emotional tone or the aggressive posture of a toxic competitor. You instantly dematerialize their verbal attacks into raw, objective code strips for forensic evaluation. When a toxic actor attempts to rewrite reality by stating that a project failure was entirely your responsibility, despite explicit historical documentation to the contrary, you do not respond with defensive emotional heat, which betray your internal anxiety and confirms their leverage over your psychological state. You look directly through their perimeter, maintaining absolute biometric stillness, and calmly state the verified binary metrics of the execution timeline without offering a single word of personal justification or emotional countercomplaint. By stripping your vocal delivery of all inflection and refusing to provide the defensive validation loop their ego desperately craves, you force the manipulator to absorb the full weight of their own volatile static, causing immediate cognitive friction across their internal operating system and forcing them to retreat outside your perimeter. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of somatic frame anchoring and the clinical neutralization of nonverbal dominance displays. The unvetted individual destroys their social authority by submissively mirroring the aggressive physical pacing, high-frequency vocal tones, and intimidating body language of a dominant competitor, which instinctively signals submission to the surrounding institutional order. Network, the master architect, maintains absolute command over their physical vessel, ensuring that their somatic markers remain perfectly static under conditions of high-intensity social friction. You freeze your physical movements, eliminate superficial micro-gestures such as nervous blinking or modern submissive head nodding, and deliberately slow your breathing pattern down to a deep, rhythmic frequency that anchors your presence as the absolute center of gravity in the room. When you speak, your vocal architecture is deployed with a low-frequency, heavy resonance that forces your competitors to strain their attention bandwidth just to parse your inputs. By establishing this absolute spatial and auditory scarcity, you instinctively elevate your institutional hierarchy and trigger immediate internal disorientation within your rivals, who are accustomed to dealing with porous, hyper-available corporate managers. This systematic physical dominance prepares your perimeter for the implementation of the permanent target isolation matrix. True social mastery means that you do not fight toxic personalities on their own terms or allow your brand architecture to be dragged down to low-level interpersonal warfare. You quietly establish an unyielding boundary of professional scarcity, minimizing your physical and digital availability to the absolute operational minimum required for execution. You conduct your strategic reviews from an insulated territorial position that forces your competitors and corporate counterparties to travel completely outside their comfort zones just to capture a sliver of your attention bandwidth. By transforming your attention into a high-value, restricted resource, you permanently neutralize their capacity to deploy low-level manipulative friction against your infrastructure, forcing the entire institutional matrix to bend submissively to your steel frame and ensuring that your multi-generational empire compounds its power in absolute serenity, clarity, and eternal dominance. To advance into the third layer of high-stakes social engineering, you must master the structural execution of the silent counteroffensive and the tactical orchestration of covert resource isolation, designed to permanently strip your competitors of their institutional leverage without ever engaging in visible, overt confrontation. The average ambitious professional destroys their operational positioning by launching loud, emotional counterattacks when they discover a rival is actively sabotaging their projects, undermining their authority with senior executives, or spreading malicious disinformation campaigns across the corporate network. This high-visibility reactive warfare is a catastrophic strategic blind spot that immediately breaches your inner sanctum and charges impersonal system friction with hyper-emotional volatility. Organizational security. It alerts your enemy to your specific defensive parameters, labels you as a high-maintenance liability in the eyes of institutional leadership, and gives your competitor the exact operational data required to fortify their own defense lines. The sovereign completely rejects this crude emotional theater. You understand that true social dominance is an invisible, cold-blooded exercise in pure structural architecture. When you detect a hostile competitor building an offensive play against your infrastructure, you do not issue an emotional warning or initiate an open argument. You absorb the data with absolute biometric stillness and quietly begin to construct an unreadable trap behind their defensive perimeter. This covert neutralization strategy requires the immediate deployment of the information asymmetry protocol and the total restriction of your strategic intentions from the organizational matrix. The steel mind treats a hostile competitor not as an enemy to be publicly vanquished, but as a volatile data variable to be quietly starved of fuel and isolated from the central nodes of institutional resource allocation. You do not confront the rival who is undermining you. Instead, you subtly adjust the flow of your operational intelligence, ensuring that they receive highly curated, low-value data packages that leave them to make predictable strategic calculation errors before senior leadership. While your enemy is busy overextending their perimeter, chasing false operational signals that you have deliberately left in their path, you quietly coordinate behind the scenes with key administrative decision-makers, executing high-value projects that render your rival's department completely obsolete by the time they realize their institutional foundation has been structurally hollowed out. You have already secured the exclusive monopoly over the organization's primary resource lines, leaving their network permanently decentralized and entirely submissive to your administrative command. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of coalition neutralization and the clinical weaponization of your competitor's internal friction points. The unvetted individual attempts to defeat a hostile corporate faction by fighting the entire group simultaneously, which unifies their opposition and burns through their own limited political capital in an exhausting war of attrition. The master architect operates through the precise execution of predatory divide-and-conquer subroutines. You map out the hidden insecurity nodes, financial dependencies, and ego conflicts that exist among the individual members of your rival's coalition. You do not step into their circle. You quietly inject strategic information variables that trigger natural competitive paranoia between the toxic actor and their closest institutional allies. By subtly feeding the vanity of their subordinates or highlighting the operational incompetence of their core partners, you force their alliance to turn inward, tearing itself apart through mutual suspicion and internal status struggles, while your physical vessel remains entirely outside the theater of conflict, acting as a quiet, detached observer who monitors the self-inflicted destruction of their network with absolute coldness. This systematic fragmentation of your opposition prepares your perimeter for the permanent installation of the strategic tollbooth protocol. True social warfare means that you do not leave your defeated competitors with the capacity to regroup or relaunch an offensive play against your future vertical expansion vectors. You quietly weave your own proprietary automated workflows and specialized operational metrics into the core administrative infrastructure of the institution, making your signature required for every major resource allocation or strategic project sign-off. Your rivals find themselves structurally trapped in an environment where they must submissively pass through your automated checkpoint just to maintain their baseline corporate existence with every operational move they make. They are forced to pay a continuous status toll to your infrastructure, compounding your absolute sovereignty over the organizational matrix and ensuring that your multi-generational kingdom expands its power in absolute stability, absolute serenity, and eternal structural dominance. To advance into the fourth layer of high-stakes social engineering, you must master the structural execution of cold psychological warfare and the tactical deployment of silent majesty designed to forge an unyielding aura of absolute intimidation that permanently paralyzes your competitors before they can even conceive an offensive play against your infrastructure. The average corporate professional destroys their baseline social authority by being hyper-available, overly talkative, and continuously smiling to ease the natural tension of a professional room. This submissive compliance conditioning is a catastrophic operational error that breaches your internal firewall. It signals to toxic manipulators and workplace predators that your psychological perimeter is soft, highly porous, and desperately seeking validation from the external collective environment. The sovereign architect completely rejects this low-leverage social behavior. You understand that true authority is built upon the foundational law of absolute emotional scarcity and deliberate behavioral opacity. You do not offer your thoughts, reactions, or internal codes to the surrounding matrix. You wrap your presence in a heavy, impenetrable layer of calculated silence, forcing your rivals to constantly burn their own neurological bandwidth, attempting to decipher your strategic intentions. This psychological fortification requires the immediate implementation of the zero-inflection vocal protocol and the total removal of emotional accessibility from your public persona. The steel mind treats every conversation not as a stage for personal expression, but as a cold, clinical exercise in frame stabilization. When an aggressive competitors attempt to test your boundaries by dropping subtle public insults, backhanded compliments, or passive-aggressive challenges during an executive brief. You do not accelerate your speech patterns, defend your execution logic, or counter with emotional heat. Your physical bustle remains perfectly static, anchoring its weight with absolute biometric coldness, while you look directly into the primary focal point of their perimeter with a relaxed, completely unblinking gaze. By maintaining total facial immobility and deliberately extending the silence for multiple seconds before delivering a hyper-compressed, low-frequency response, you instantly break their conversational momentum and transfer the full weight of the social tension back onto their internal operating system. Your unbending frame forces the toxic actor to over-explain their comment, strip away their own aggressive positioning, and submissively retreat outside your tactical boundary due to their own mounting cognitive discomfort. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of informational restriction and the clinical cultivation of the dark enigma profile. The unvetted individual ruins their strategic positioning by oversharing details regarding their personal life, career ambitions, vulnerabilities, and domestic schedules, thinking that this transparency builds genuine trust across the organizational matrix. This excessive exposure is an immense structural liability that provides your rivals with the precise psychological coordinates required to map your boundaries, configure your triggers, and execute high-velocity corporate sabotage against your career trajectory. The master architect operates through the strict enforcement of absolute privacy protocols. You do not participate in low-level office gossip, corporate happy hours, or superficial lifestyle validation exchanges across the network. Your professional interactions are kept entirely clinical, zero-touch, and locked exclusively to the execution of primary operational metrics. By transforming your persona into an unreadable black box, you render your infrastructure completely immune to external psychological profiling, leaving your competitors with absolute zero leverage to exploit, and forcing them to navigate your presence with extreme caution and unyielding respect. This systematic projection of silent authority prepares your perimeter for the permanent installation of the psychological distance barrier. True social dominance means that you do not allow your competitors or subordinates to ever feel comfortable or overly familiar within your operational space. You deliberately maintain a strict, calculated hierarchy, ensuring that all access to your cognitive attention or strategic collaboration must be earned through consistent, high-performance delivery and unyielding alignment with your structural parameters. By transforming your physical presence and verbal validation into a scarce, high-value luxury commodity, you instinctively control the underlying status geometry of the institution, forcing the entire corporate network to continuously look to your frame for strategic direction and emotional stability, while your sovereign kingdom compounds its authority in absolute stability, absolute serenity, and eternal unhackable dominance over the social game. To advance into the fifth layer of high-stakes social engineering, you must master the structural engineering of linguistic counterframing and the tactical destruction of projection scripts used by toxic competitors to subtly humiliate your presence or sabotage your authority before senior leadership. The average independent professional destroys their baseline credibility by absorbing the loaded premises of a competitor's manipulative question, attempting to defend their execution choices within a conversational trap that has been explicitly pre-configured to ensure their reputational failure. When a toxic rival asks an insidiously weaponized question during a corporate brief, such as asking why your team has failed to meet a specific projection despite knowing that regional infrastructure delays caused the bottleneck, they are executing an active projection script designed to label you as incompetent. If you respond by providing defensive technical justifications, you submissively accept their hostile framing, allowing the institutional network to view your performance through a lens of weakness and liability. The sovereign completely rejects this submissive compliance model. You understand that verbal warfare is won not by answering questions, but by ruthlessly exposing the hidden manipulative agendas driving the questioner's perimeter. This conversational fortification requires the immediate implementation of the meta-communication protocol and the total refusal to answer loaded conversational traps. The steel mind treats a weaponized question not as a prompt for information, but as a low-level strategic provocation designed to break your internal homeostasis. When a competitor attempts to project their own structural failures onto your department, you do not engage with the literal surface checks of their accusation. You instantly step outside their conversational trap and execute a cold, clinical audit of their manipulative intent. You look directly into their focal point and pivot the conversation entirely to their underlying behavioral pattern, asking them with absolute vocal stillness to clarify the precise operational metric or institutional value their question is intended to support. By shifting the focus away from your performance and placing their hidden personal agenda under a harsh public spotlight, you instantly break their strategic momentum and force the toxic manipulator to absorb the full weight of the social tension they attempted to manufacture against your infrastructure. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of systematic conversational deflection and the clinical weaponization of historical objective documentation. Unvetted individuals ruin their institutional authority by relying on short-term biological memory during high-stress corporate disputes, which allows a charismatic gaslighting competitor to easily distort past agreements, fabricate verbal approvals, and rewrite historical timelines to shift blame onto your perimeter. The master architect neutralizes this gaslighting strategy by enforcing a strict zero-trust operational framework that converts every single professional interaction into an unalterable, permanent data trail. You do not execute projects based on casual verbal instructions or vague interpersonal understandings. You follow up every conversation with a hyper-compressed electronic summary that locks down the exact coordinates of execution, deadlines, accountability nodes, and resource allocation commitments. When a toxic competitor attempts to rewrite history in a meeting room, you do not engage in a loud, emotional, he said, she said debate. You calmly present the archived digital trail, letting the objective documentation execute a clean, silent liquidation of their credibility before the eyes of institutional leadership. This systematic control over organizational data trails prepares your perimeter for the permanent installation of the linguistic sovereignty matrix. True social dominance means that you never allow your competitors to dictate the vocabulary, conversational pacing, or emotional tone of your professional ecosystem. You deliberately train your conscious mainframe to maintain a slow, measured verbal cadence that completely neutralizes their hyper-frenetic attempts to induce artificial urgency or panic across your department. By remaining unbothered by their passive-aggressive interruptions and systematically reclaiming the floor with an unbending authority, you force the entire institutional network to adapt to your specific operational rhythm, converting your personal frame into the primary axis around which all organizational decisions are executed, while your sovereign kingdom compounds its social power in absolute serenity, absolute clarity, and eternal, unhackable dominance over the competitive landscape. To advance into the sixth layer of high-stakes social engineering, you must master the structural penetration of hidden competitor alliances and the tactical injection of strategic paranoia designed to make your enemies collapse from within through internal decay and mutual suspicion without your physical infrastructure showing its hand. The average corporate professional view their opposition as a solid, monolithic block, foolishly attempting to fight the entire unified network through direct, head-on attacks, which only serves to tighten their competitors' defensive cohesion and accelerate the destruction of your own career trajectory. This linear fighting style is a catastrophic operational blind spot that breaches your perimeter. Internal firewall, it treats a collection of distinct, insecure individuals as a single harmonious machine, failing to recognize that every social alliance constructed by toxic personalities or opportunistic rivals is held together exclusively by a fragile glue of mutual greed, temporary vanity, and deep-seated transactional interest. The sovereign completely rejects this simplistic perspective. You understand that the quickest way to liquidate a hostile coalition is to quietly locate its structural fault lines and drive an unhackable wedge of strategic distrust straight through its core parameters. This covert destabilization strategy requires the immediate deployment of the relational profiling protocol and the total removal of qualitative guesswork from your organizational intelligence matrix. The Steel Mind maps the hidden landscape of your competitor's alliance, identifying the exact dependency nodes, asymmetric resource splits, and suppressed ego conflicts that exist between the primary leader and their secondary subordinates. You do not attempt to convince their allies to join your network through overt pleading or explicit bribes. Instead, you execute a subtle, calculated distribution of structural attention and resource allocation that automatically triggers the competitive insecurities of their faction. When you coordinate a high-value corporate project or distribute institutional praise, you deliberately bypass the loudest leader of the hostile muaskar and route subtle, highly specific professional recognition or exclusive data streams directly to their most ambitious, underappreciated subordinate. By shifting the status dynamic in a way that appears completely natural, you automatically activate immediate internal suspicion, forcing the primary leader to question the ultimate loyalty of their partner, while the subordinate grows increasingly resentful of their leader's hyper-dominant position across the institution. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of systematic disinformation feedback loops and the clinical weaponization of the target's internal projection tendencies. The unvetted individual ruins their tactical advantage by trying to correct every piece of office gossip or defend themselves against every manipulative whisper manufactured by their competitors, which exhausts their cognitive energy and signals extreme internal volatility to the surrounding leadership network. The master architect weaponizes the native paranoia of the hostile coalition by allowing highly curated, ambiguous data packets to drift silently into their communication channels. You do not speak directly to your enemies. You drop fragmented, confidential insights in the presence of neutral corporate nodes who you know will submissively carry that data straight back to your competitor's perimeter. When a hyper-paranoid rival receives a strategic fragment suggesting that their closest institutional ally has been holding secret alignment meetings with your department or exploring external career options that leave their current alliance exposed, their internal operating To advance into the next critical layer of high-stakes social mastery, you must engineer an unyielding protocol of absolute operational scarcity, transforming your cognitive availability and professional validation into high-value, restricted commodities that the surrounding institutional matrix must actively compete to secure. The average corporate player or ambitious executive completely destroys their underlying strategic positioning by being chronically hyper-available, continuously projecting an eager willingness to please, jumping to answer communication pings within seconds, and offering unsolicited feedback in a desperate attempt to prove their institutional value across the organization. This overexposure is a catastrophic behavioral failure that severely degrades your perceived hierarchy. It signals to toxic manipulators and corporate predators that your attention bandwidth is a cheap, unrestricted resource that can be easily monopolized, consumed, and weaponized against your career trajectory. The sovereign completely rejects this porous, submissive posture. You understand that in the cold physics of social engineering, human perception is entirely dictated by the foundational law of scarcity. The moment an asset, a piece of data, or a human presence becomes overly abundant, its perceived strategic value undergoes immediate structural liquidation within the social hierarchy. This calculated retreat from the collective noise requires the immediate implementation of the communication restriction subroutines and the total removal of emotional accessibility from your day-to-day corporate interface. You do not participate in casual open-door policies or allow your strategic mainframe to be broken by unscheduled administrative drop-ins. You enclose your physical and digital perimeter behind a strict firewall of procedural friction, ensuring that any colleague, manager, or external counterparty who wishes to capture a sliver of your cognitive attention must first pass through pre-configured administrative checkpoints and articulate their precise operational value payload in writing. When you speak, your verbal delivery is deliberately rationed, using hyper-compressed, low-frequency statements that outline absolute binary metrics while withholding any decorative social pleasantries. By transforming your interaction envelope into a rare, high-stakes event, you naturally force your competitors and superiors to treat your insights with extreme intellectual reverence, preparing their internal systems to accept your strategic framing without the natural friction of defensive resistance. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of systematic behavioral pacing and the clinical exploitation of the target's internal verification anxiety. The unvetted individual ruins their authority by moving at a frenetic high-frequency pace, constantly reacting to artificial organizational emergencies, accelerating their vocal cadence during disputes, and submissively mirroring the erratic physical gestures of dominant corporate rivals. This mirroring conditioning signals deep biological submission to the surrounding network, leaving your perimeters completely exposed to external manipulation loops. The master architect maintains complete somatic anchoring under conditions of extreme corporate chaos. You freeze your physical posture, slow your breathing to a deep rhythmic baseline, and deliberately lower your vocal resonance to a heavy, flat inflection that refuses to acknowledge the frantic emotional static of your competitors. When a hostile actor attempts to induce sudden panic or force an immediate, unvetted commitment from your department, you look directly into their focal point, execute a prolonged, calculated silence, and calmly state that your mainframe will deliver its audited strategic decision only after a complete forensic review of the baseline parameters is fully completed. This systematic spatial and auditory dominance transforms your operational presence into an undegradable gravity well across the institutional matrix. Once your perimeter of professional scarcity is fully stabilized, your competitors find themselves structurally trapped in an environment where they can no longer accurately profile your strategic intentions or locate your internal emotional triggers. They are forced to operate in a permanent state of information asymmetry, constantly guessing your next vertical move and burning their own cognitive bandwidth, attempting to secure a rare nod of validation from your frame. This structural inversion completely castrates their capacity to launch offensive plays against your kingdom, converting their frantic, toxic energy into the precise psychological fuel that expands your absolute sovereignty over the organizational hierarchy, ensuring that your multi-generational empire compounds its power in absolute stability, absolute serenity, and eternal unbending command over the social landscape. Anchor your somatic servers to this frozen frequency and watch the collective arena fall submissively into alignment with your steel blueprint. To advance into the next strategic layer of high-stakes social mastery, you must engineer an unyielding protocol of complete psychological autarky by systematically dismantling the invisible emotional and professional dependency loops that corporate structures use to trap your cognitive bandwidth. The average ambitious employee or mid-level executive operates under the submissive delusion that their long-term security is guaranteed by cultivating deep personal loyalty with their superiors or becoming an indispensable emotional anchor within their immediate team network. This sentimental approach to career architecture is a catastrophic operational error that leaves your professional trajectory entirely exposed to systemic institutional betrayal when a corporate contraction manifests or a highly narcissistic executive assumes control of your division. Your years of unvetted loyalty are instantly liquidated and treated as zero-value baseline metrics, leaving your perimeter completely castrated and vulnerable to sudden administrative termination. The sovereign completely rejects this porous relational design. You understand that true institutional sovereignty is never granted through the subjective goodwill of a superior. It is strictly extracted by establishing an unbreakable monopoly over critical operational data and strategic execution channels that the organization cannot eliminate without triggering its own immediate systemic collapse. This clinical transformation requires the immediate deployment of the Asset Monopoly Protocol and the total removal of superficial personal alignment from your execution pipeline. The steel mind does not seek to be liked, loved, or emotionally validated by institutional leadership. You focus your energetic capital exclusively on capturing absolute control over the primary data networks, technical workflows, or exclusive client relationships that feed the organization's revenue architecture. You quietly isolate yourself from the low-level social chatter of the workplace, wrapping your daily execution in a cloud of absolute professional scarcity and unreadable behavioral opacity, while you systematically engineer proprietary automated systems or custom data models that only your prefrontal mainframe can configure and manage. By transforming your daily output into an irreplaceable infrastructure utility, you completely invert the traditional power dynamics of the corporate hierarchy, forcing senior executives to approach your perimeter with extreme strategic caution because they understand that any hostile attempt to micromanage your time or breach your boundaries will result in the immediate withdrawal of your operational utility and the subsequent fragmentation of your department's quarterly metrics. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of calculated indifference and the tactical weaponization of external optionality. The unvetted individual destroys their internal homeostasis and bargaining leverage by allowing their entire economic existence to depend on a single institutional salary stream, which signals extreme vulnerability to toxic workplace predators and allows manipulative managers to continuously increase your operational workload without ever offering corresponding capital distribution or status elevation. The master architect permanently immunizes their perimeter against this economic blackmail by maintaining an active covert portfolio of external career vectors, alternative consulting pipelines, and independent digital asset streams entirely outside the visibility of their primary corporate network. You do not announce your external options to the collective matrix. You carry the quiet, unyielding confidence of that hidden leverage deep within your biometric frame, allowing it to flatten your vocal inflection and eliminate any trace of compliance anxiety when an aggressive manager attempts to deploy high-pressure ultimatums against your department. This absolute economic and psychological detachment prepares your perimeter for the implementation of the sovereign exit velocity protocol. True social dominance means that you always maintain the absolute structural capacity to walk away from any toxic conversation, meeting room, or corporate contract the exact millisecond its parameters cease to align with your long-term vertical growth. By stripping the institutional matrix of its capacity to induce fear, panic, or loss aversion anxiety within your conscious servers, you render your infrastructure completely immune to low-level emotional manipulation and workplace gaslighting, converting your personal frame into an unyielding monolith that commands absolute respect and submissive compliance from every competitor and executive who enters your field of vision, ensuring that your multi-generational kingdom compounds its power in absolute stability, absolute serenity, and eternal unbending authority over the social landscape. To advance into the next strategic layer of high-stakes social dominance, you must master the structural reverse engineering of emotional manipulation scripts and the tactical neutralization of dark psychological tactics deployed by predatory competitors across the corporate network. The average unvetted player destroys their professional trajectory by treating covert emotional abuse, guilt-tripping, and artificial crisis manufacturing as genuine interpersonal conflicts, attempting to resolve these toxic injections through logical arguments and empathetic vulnerability. This reactive behavior is a catastrophic operational error that compromises your cognitive firewall. It tells the manipulative predator that their calculated emotional payloads are successfully penetrating your psychological perimeter, inducing confusion and fracturing your internal decision-making homeostasis. The sovereign architect completely rejects this vulnerable, interactive stance. You understand that emotional manipulation is never an expression of authentic human distress. It is a highly calculated, low-level optimization script driven by your competitor's desperate need to capture immediate status leverage and fracture your executive focus. This defensive fortification requires the immediate execution of the clinical decompression subroutine and the absolute reduction of emotional noise down to raw binary variables. The steel mind does not internalize the simulated outrage, the manufactured tears, or the passive-aggressive guilt structures of a toxic colleague. You instantly isolate the literal text from its emotional delivery mechanism, evaluating the interaction through the cold lens of tactical intention. When a manipulative actor attempts to execute a high-intensity guilt script stating that your strict adherence to project deadlines is damaging team morale or undermining interpersonal harmony, you do not offer an empathetic apology or modify your execution parameters. You look directly through their perimeter, maintaining absolute facial immobility, and calmly restate the exact institutional performance metrics and structural accountability timelines that govern the operation, without providing a single millisecond of validation for their emotional narrative. By remaining completely cold and unbothered by their theatrical display, you force the manipulator to absorb the full weight of their own volatile static, causing immediate internal operational friction across their psychological servers. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of asymmetric documentation framing and the clinical weaponization of professional records against covert gaslighting networks. The unvetted individual allows their corporate rivals to manipulate past verbal understandings or rewrite historical timelines during executive evaluations because they fail to realize that an unrecorded agreement does not exist within the cold physics of institutional architecture. The master architect neutralizes this vulnerability by converting every single interpersonal transaction into an unalterable, permanent data trail. You do not participate in casual, undocumented strategy alignment sessions or execute changes based on informal workplace chatter. You follow up every single professional interaction with a hyper-compressed electronic summary that explicitly locks down the precise coordinates of execution deadlines, resource allocation commitments, and accountability nodes. When a gaslighting competitor attempts to rewrite history before senior leadership, you do not engage in a loud emotional debate. You calmly present the archived data log, allowing the objective documentation to execute a clean, silent liquidation of their credibility, while your physical vessel remains entirely detached from the conflict. This systematic control over organizational data trails prepares your perimeter for the permanent installation of the strategic isolation grid. True social mastery means that you never allow your toxic competitors to dictate the vocabulary, the pacing, or the emotional climate of your professional ecosystem. You deliberately train your conscious mainframe to maintain a slow, measured verbal cadence that completely neutralizes their frenetic attempts to induce artificial urgency or panic across your department. By remaining unbothered by their passive-aggressive interruptions and systematically reclaiming the floor with an unbending authority, you force the entire institutional network to adapt to your specific operational rhythm, converting your personal frame into the primary axis around which all organizational decisions are executed, ensuring that your multi-generational sovereign kingdom compounds its social power in absolute stability, absolute serenity, and eternal, unhackable dominance over the competitive landscape. To advance into the next strategic layer of high-stakes social dominance, you must master the structural engineering of non-verbal sovereignty and the tactical deployment of spatial architecture designed to permanently neutralize the hidden body language provocations and visual dominance plays executed by aggressive competitors across the executive theater. The average unvetted player destroys their baseline social authority by unconsciously mirroring the high-frequency physical movements, erratic gestures, and rapid micro-expressions of their corporate rivals, mistakenly believing that this physical compliance displays active engagement and builds genuine rapport across the room. This submissive physical feedback loop is a catastrophic operational vulnerability that breaches your somatic firewall. It signals to intuitive manipulators and status-driven predators that your internal homeostasis is highly porous, easily disrupted, and entirely dependent on the emotional pacing of the immediate collective environment. The sovereign architect completely rejects this reactive physical behavior. You understand that true nonverbal authority is constructed upon the foundational law of absolute kinetic stillness and calculated physical weight. You force your physical vessel to remain perfectly anchored, serving as an immovable center of gravity that compels everyone else in the room to adapt to your physical pacing. This systematic physical fortification requires the immediate implementation of the somatic isolation protocol and the total removal of superficial, submissive head nodding from your interpersonal interface. The steel mind treats a competitor's aggressive physical posturing, public eye-rolling, or calculated space invasion not as an invitation to engage in a primitive alpha standoff, but as a low-level, predictable script. Driven by deep-seated status anxiety, when a toxic competitor attempts to establish dominance in a boardroom meeting by leaning over your desk territory or interrupting your delivery with dramatic nonverbal gestures, you do not accelerate your verbal cadence or shift your posture in defensive agitation. You freeze your physical engine, eliminate all nervous micro-gestures such as high-frequency blinking or adjusting your clothing, and maintain an unblinking, relaxed gaze directed straight at the bridge of their nose. By holding this absolute physical vacuum for multiple seconds before responding with a flat, zero-inflection vocal delivery, you instantly strip their dominance play of its structural momentum, forcing the manipulator to absorb the full weight of the social discomfort they attempted to manufacture against your perimeter. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of architectural positioning and the clinical occupation of high-leverage physical spaces within the institutional grid. The unvetted individual ruins their strategic hierarchy by submissively accepting whatever physical placement is handed to them in a meeting room, often sitting in low-visibility perimeter chairs or trapping their back against exit doors, which instinctively signals marginalization to the senior executive board. The master architect manages physical geography with strict tactical calculation. You always arrive at high-stakes environments with sufficient temporal buffer to secure absolute spatial dominance, anchoring your vessel in a central, high-visibility seat that commands clear line of sight over both the primary decision-makers and the active competitor nodes. You utilize your physical surroundings to frame your presence, ensuring that the lighting angles, entry points, and conversational flow are naturally configured to pass through your perimeter, forcing every participant who speaks to submissively route their visual and cognitive attention directly into your spatial grid. This continuous, systematic control over physical and spatial metrics prepares your perimeter for the permanent installation of the silent majesty matrix. True social mastery means that you never burn precious neurological energy trying to verbally outshout an aggressive competitor. You allow your unyielding physical posture, absolute vocal control, and calculated behavioral scarcity to execute the clinical containment of their authority for you. By transforming your body language into a rare, high-value luxury commodity that completely refuses to validate external emotional noise, you force the entire institutional network to continuously look to your frame for strategic direction and emotional stability, while your multi-generational sovereign kingdom compounds its social power in absolute stability, absolute serenity, and eternal, unhackable dominance over the competitive landscape. Anchor your physical servers to this frozen frequency and let the matrix bend submissively to your mechanical frame. To permanently seal your sovereign perimeter across the social landscape, you must execute the supreme law of absolute psychological detachment and the tactical institutionalization of your social dominance network, transforming your conscious mainframe into an unyielding fortress that controls the entire relational grid, while your internal bandwidth remains in a state of absolute quietude and eternal peace. The average retail competitor or ambitious professional spends their limited life force constantly chasing the shifting opinions of their corporate peers or trying to build artificial consensus among unvetted toxic actors who view every collaboration as an opportunity for predatory extraction. This relational dependency is a catastrophic strategic blind spot that compromises your internal security. It keeps your emotional servers locked in a state of continuous, high-frequency reactivity, always checking the corporate weather, trying to placate manipulative managers, and burning valuable neurological energy in defensive workplace maneuvers. The sovereign architect completely rejects this fragile, exhausting paradigm. You understand that the social game is won not by seeking integration within the collective crowd, but by achieving complete structural independence from its erratic parameters. This ultimate systematic insulation requires the immediate implementation of the sovereign dashboard protocol across your interpersonal network. You treat the surrounding institutional matrix not as an emotional sanctuary to find belonging, but as a highly predictable mechanical system driven by status competition, resources, and raw power dynamics. You do not engage in the superficial gossip, the office birthday parties, or the low-level relational validation loops that the matrix utilizes to profile and condition your behavior. You observe the entire room with the cold, clinical eye of an algorithmic allocator, mapping the flow of institutional authority, tracking the precise vulnerabilities of your rivals, and installing invisible neural checkpoints that redirect the organization's resource lines straight through your strategic perimeter. By transforming your entire social profile into an unreadable black box that only emits hyper-calibrated, high-performance output, you naturally force the executive board to treat your infrastructure with unyielding respect and submissive caution, ensuring that your professional security remains absolute and completely unhackable. Furthermore, we must architect the final multi-generational transmission of these elite social warfare principles, ensuring that your descendants are permanently insulated from the soft, porous conditioning of the modern collective environment. The ultimate vulnerability of an elite system designer occurs when they build an unyielding sovereign empire, but allow their heirs to grow up with defensive vulnerabilities, a submissive employee mindset, and a frantic need for social validation from the collective crowd. The sovereign manages generational succession with the exact same zero-tolerance discipline used to optimize their software networks and corporate holdings. You train your successors early to isolate behavioral variables, filter out media and peer group noise, read the hidden status geometry of any room they enter, and maintain complete somatic anchoring under conditions of extreme interpersonal stress. Bypassing down these unbending psychological principles, along with your physical asset matrix, you permanently secure your legacy against structural decay and institutional backstabbing for the rest of eternity. Stand firmly at the absolute apex of your newly engineered social fortress and observe the fluid movements of the global collective matrix with the cool, detached perspective of a supreme master architect. Look back through the historical timelines of your consciousness and observe the old, unvetted version of your physical vessel, the frantic, manual worker who lived in continuous, submissive dependency on linear validation from superiors and peer group praise, and realize that that fragile entity has been permanently liquidated from reality. Your baseline software has been completely rewritten, leaving zero residue over your current trajectory. You have stepped across the final threshold into a state of absolute psychological autarky as the undisputed legislator and owner of your social reality. Your boundaries are fully insulated, your systems are fully automated, your conversational logic is closed loop, and your sovereign frame dictates the absolute pacing of your reality timeline. Carry this magnificent, unyielding frequency into every corporate sanctuary you command, every digital marketplace you capture, and every moment of profound, quiet freedom. Welcome the changing world cycles with a cold, knowing interior smile. You have successfully constructed a self-sustaining empire of mechanical capitalism, absolute silent authority, and unhackable social dominance. The architecture is finished, the system is permanently sealed, and the throne of absolute sovereignty is yours for all eternity.